Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. No matter how well seated you are in presence, the level of ego in others and in the world, in business, in schools, and in other institutions and organizations makes staying in presence challenging. If you didn't have an ego yourself, the level of ego in the world would be far less challenging. But egos activate other egos, and that's the problem. The problem with being in the world, then, is a problem within you and not really with the world, and that's important to see. The world doesn't have to change a bit for you to be in presence, and from presence for you to have an impact on the world. You just have to learn to hold your own in the world. One thing that helps is simply knowing that egos activate your own ego and that other people's egos will try to pull you into their state of consciousness. Egos can't help doing this, but you can help yourself stay in presence by remaining conscious and aware while speaking and interacting with others. Here are some of the things egos do to draw you into their world. Egos state an opinion to elicit an opinion from you, and then the debate is on. Egos love debating because they love demonstrating that they're right or smarter than someone else, although their opinions rarely prove that. Egos need to be right, and for that an opinion is needed. Opinions are also good for stirring up emotions and creating drama, which egos also love. The problem with opinions is that none of them contains the whole truth. Egos tell stories about what happened to them because those stories and the emotions they stir up give them a sense of identity. This happened to me. By retelling those stories, they get to keep their self-images, which the false self needs to exist. Egos complain. Sharing likes and dislikes is a favorite pastime of egos. "I like this," says one. "Oh, I don't like that," says another. This passes as camaraderie, but what it really does is shore up the sense of I. Now you've taken a stand. Now you're somebody. Egos judge others. Egos love to talk about others, often under the guise of sharing information and insights or trying to understand or fix other people. However, within such conversations is generally an agenda on the part of the egos to prove themselves right and superior to others. Egos love to give unsolicited advice. While pretending to be helpful, advice is often a type of opinion and serves to position the one giving the advice as right or superior. Although wisdom coming from presence might appear at times to be advice, usually those receiving such wisdom can tell the difference between that and the ego's advice, and they respond accordingly. These types of communication are red flags pointing to the ego. From presence, there is only clear seeing of this, compassion for the human condition, and acceptance for this being the way it is. Any judgment you have around these things is just more ego to be noticed and have compassion for. Others are the way they are, and in that moment, they can be no other way than that. The same goes for you as well. The best approach for dealing with egoic communications is to listen quietly without chiming in with your own opinions, judgments, advice, stories, or complaints. This will keep you from getting pulled into the thought stream that's coming out of other people's mouths. Just notice what's being spoken without identifying with it, without agreeing or disagreeing with it. When you're noticing from a place of neutrality, equanimity, and compassion, you know you're in presence. The funny thing is, the less you say in most conversations, the nicer you're likely to seem to others, and the nicer you're likely to actually be. The impulsive need to speak is almost always the ego, as it pushes forward to get some need met by the conversation, to be right, to be seen as smart, or to gain approval. Curtailing that impulse to speak keeps the ego out of the conversation and gives presence a chance instead. By being quiet, you're making space for presence in the conversation, and people will feel that. Then speak only when you're moved to speak by presence. Just as you might wait before answering an email, waiting a moment before speaking will help you stay connected to presence and make it more likely you'll express presence instead of the ego when you do speak. Here are some tips for staying in presence when you're having a conversation. Notice what others are saying and where it's coming from, the ego or presence. Notice what your own thought stream might be producing in response to theirs. Keep your attention on what you're experiencing in the here and now, on the aliveness in your body, and on your sensory experience. Stay seated in what is noticing. Stay with what is aware. When you're speaking, be attentive to how much ego is in what you're saying, particularly in your I statements. When you say I, notice what that's like. Can you hear the ego? Can you feel it? Your own presence is what's able to know this. Being identified with the ego feels tight, contracted, and icky. The more identified you are with I, the less good you feel about yourself, and the stronger the need is to defend yourself, be right, and be special. Those who have very little identification with the ego have difficulty even saying I, because that seems so false. So if you have a hard time saying or believing I, or believing what you're saying after you say I, that's a very good sign. It means you aren't very identified with the false self. Noticing that you believe what you're saying to different degrees, even as the words come out of your mouth, is an excellent practice. Eventually you'll be left mostly with words that come from presence. The degree to which you believe what you're saying is the degree to which you're identified with the false self, and also the degree to which presence is there, since presence is what notices identification. The more ego or identification with thought there is, the less presence there is. The less ego or identification with thought there is, the more presence there is. The word identification gives the impression that ego identification is either happening or not. You're either identified or not. But rather than being black or white, there are many shades of identification, just as there are many degrees in which you believe something. You may believe or be identified with a thought just a little or completely. Those are two very different states of consciousness. The egoic state is one in which you believe your thoughts without question. The enlightened state is when you no longer believe your thoughts. Talking about yourself can be a slippery slope. You may start out not identified at all with I and end up more identified than you'd like. Limiting how much you say at any one time will make it less likely that your ego will step in and take over. Both conscious and unconscious people often start out speaking in equanimity and aligned with love and good intentions, but then the ego slips in and inserts its point of view, and the emotions, the clouds, begin to roll in. State what you want to say briefly, and then stop and let others speak. Find out what they have to bring to the flow of conversation. Being present to others stands a chance of bringing others into presence with you. Presence is not only good for you, but for everyone. So although egos can activate your ego and get it going in directions you don't want to go, being in presence can activate presence in others and help turn the world around, one person at a time. Your conversations and interactions with others will change dramatically once you begin living more from presence. One of the ways they're likely to change is that you'll lose interest in being with those who are deeply invested in their egos and uncomfortable or unfamiliar with presence. Your friends just might change, but that's okay. Other people will take their place, or you'll simply enjoy more time alone or with your loved ones. Thank you for being here. I am with you always.